Every single glass of whiskey on earth, whether it costs $5 or $500,000, starts the exact same way. Grain, water, and yeast. That's it. No secret ingredient, no magic formula. And yet from that one simple process, humans have built more than a dozen wildly different spirits. Some smoky enough to taste like a campfire, some sweet enough to taste like dessert, some so rare that a single bottle has sold for over $1 million at auction. Empires have taxed it, wars have interrupted it, entire industries have collapsed and been rebuilt because of it. This is the story of every major whiskey style in the world, how they were born, why they taste the way they do, and the strange history hiding behind every bottle.
Single malt Scotch. Single malt Scotch is made at one distillery using only malted barley, water, and yeast, then aged in oak casks for at least 3 years inside Scotland. The word whiskey itself comes from the Gaelic Uisce Baha, meaning water of life. And monks are believed to have brought distillation techniques to Scotland from Ireland or continental Europe sometime around the 1400s. Early Scottish whiskey wasn't aged at all. It was harsh, clear, and drunk almost immediately after distillation. Aging in oak barrels only became standard practice in the 1800s, partly by accident, since whiskey was often shipped and stored in old sherry or wine casks that happened to mellow the spirit and give it color. Scotland is divided into 5 whiskey-producing regions: Speyside, Highlands, Lowlands, Campbelltown, and Islay. And each region has developed a distinct house style based on local water, climate, and tradition. Speyside malts tend to be fruity and elegant, while Highland malts vary widely from light to rich. A single malt must legally be distilled twice in copper pot stills, and the shape of those stills actually changes the flavor. Taller stills produce lighter spirit, shorter ones produce heavier, oilier whiskey. Today, single malt Scotch is one of the most collected spirits in the world, with rare bottles from closed distilleries selling at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Blended Scotch whiskey. Blended Scotch is a mix of single malt whiskeys from multiple distilleries combined with grain whiskey, which is a lighter, cheaper spirit usually made from wheat or corn in continuous column stills rather than pot stills. Blending became popular in the 1800s after a French wine blight destroyed European vineyards and cognac supplies, pushing wealthy drinkers toward whiskey instead. Blenders like Johnnie Walker and Chivas realized that combining dozens of malts with grain whiskey created a smoother, more consistent product that appealed to a much wider audience than the often harsh single malts of the time. A master blender's job is essentially to recreate the exact same flavor profile year after year, even though the individual malts going into the recipe are constantly changing due to cask aging and availability. Some blends contain whiskey from over 40 different distilleries. Blended Scotch makes up more than 90% of all Scotch whiskey sold globally, making it far more common than single malt, despite single malt getting most of the prestige and marketing attention. Johnnie Walker alone sells more bottles worldwide than any other whiskey brand. Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey is typically distilled 3 times, one more pass than the double distillation used in Scotland, which produces a noticeably lighter and smoother spirit. Ireland actually has a strong claim to inventing whiskey distillation before Scotland did, with some records suggesting Irish monks were distilling spirits as early as the 1200s. By the late 1800s, Irish whiskey was the most popular whiskey style in the world, outselling Scotch significantly, with Dublin alone home to some of the largest distilleries on earth. That dominance collapsed due to a combination of factors. The Irish War of Independence and the resulting trade war with the British Empire cut off major export markets. And American Prohibition eliminated Ireland's biggest customer overnight. By the 1970s, the entire Irish whiskey industry had shrunk to just 2 operating distilleries. Only in the last 2 decades has Irish whiskey seen a dramatic global revival, with dozens of new distilleries opening. Unlike Scotch, Irish whiskey doesn't require peat smoke in the malting process, which is why it generally tastes cleaner and fruitier rather than smoky. Bourbon must be made in the United States from a mash that's at least 51% corn and aged in new charred oak barrels that can never be reused for bourbon again afterward. This charring requirement is what gives bourbon its deep amber color and heavy vanilla, caramel, and toasted oak flavor, since the charred wood layer acts almost like a filter and flavor infuser during aging. The name most likely comes from Bourbon County in Kentucky, though the exact origin story is debated, and today the vast majority of bourbon is still produced produced in Kentucky specifically, thanks to the region's iron-free limestone water. That limestone naturally filters out iron, which would otherwise turn the whiskey black and give it a metallic taste, while adding calcium that helps yeast during fermentation. Because the used barrels can't be reused for bourbon, American bourbon distilleries sell their retired barrels to Scotch and rum producers around the world, meaning a huge portion of the world's aged spirits were technically finished in barrels that once held Kentucky bourbon. Bourbon production is also protected by U.S. law and international trade agreements as a distinctly American product, similar to how champagne is protected for France. Tennessee whiskey. Tennessee whiskey follows almost the exact same legal rules as bourbon, but with one additional required step called the Lincoln County process, where the raw spirit is filtered slowly through thick layers of sugar maple charcoal before it goes into the barrel. This charcoal mellowing step is what separates Tennessee whiskey from bourbon and gives it a smoother, slightly sweeter character with less of the sharp grain bite you get in some bourbons. The maple charcoal itself is made by burning stacks of sugar maple wood on site, and the process can take anywhere from several days to over a week depending on the brand. Jack Daniel's is by far the most recognizable Tennessee whiskey and one of the best-selling whiskeys on the planet, technically making Tennessee whiskey a bourbon by ingredient rules, even though the brand famously insists on calling it something different because of that extra filtering step. Some smaller Tennessee producers use a shorter version of the charcoal process, while others still do the full traditional mellowing by hand in wooden vat. Rye whiskey. Rye whiskey requires a mash of at least 51% rye grain, which produces a spicier, drier, and more peppery flavor compared to the sweeter profile of corn-heavy bourbon. Rye was actually the dominant whiskey style in colonial America and the early United States, especially in Pennsylvania and Maryland, since rye grew easily in the colder northeastern climate where corn struggled. Classic cocktails like the Manhattan, the Sazerac, and the original Old Fashioned were all built around rye whiskey specifically, not bourbon, before Prohibition wiped out most American rye distilleries and bourbon took over as the country's default whiskey style. Rye nearly disappeared entirely by the mid-1900s, with only a handful of brands surviving the collapse. The American cocktail renaissance of the 2000s brought rye whiskey back from near extinction as bartenders rediscovered the older, spicier cocktail recipes and demanded the ingredient that made them work. Canadian whiskey is also frequently made with a heavy rye content, which is why many people in North America casually call Canadian whiskey rye, even when the actual grain percentage is lower than the American legal definition requires. Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey has some of the most flexible legal rules of any major whiskey category, requiring only that it's produced in Canada, aged at least 3 years in wood, and made from cereal grain mash. Unlike bourbon or Scotch, there's no strict requirement on grain percentages, which lets Canadian distillers blend different grain whiskeys, corn, rye, wheat, barley, in whatever proportions create the flavor profile they want. Historically, Canadian whiskey became enormously popular in the United States during Prohibition, since it remained perfectly legal in Canada and was smuggled across the border in massive quantities, with Canadian distillers like Hiram Walker building fortunes almost entirely off American bootleggers. The style is generally known for being light, smooth, and easy drinking compared to the bolder American or Scottish styles, which made it a popular base for mixed drinks throughout the 1900s. Canadian whiskey is often blended from separately distilled and aged grain whiskeys that are only combined right before bottling, rather than being mashed together from the start like most other whiskey styles. Crown Royal remains the best-known and best-selling Canadian whiskey brand internationally. Japanese Whisky. Japanese whiskey was directly inspired by Scotch, with its founder having traveled to Scotland in the early 1900s specifically to study distillation methods before bringing that knowledge home. The industry's two founding figures built Japan's first major distilleries in the 1920s, deliberately choosing locations with climates and water sources that mimicked the Scottish Highlands. For decades, Japanese whiskey was seen mainly as a domestic product, but that changed dramatically after Japanese whiskey started winning blind taste test awards against top Scotch brands in international competitions during the 2000s and 2010s. That sudden global recognition created a massive demand spike that most Japanese distilleries weren't prepared for, since whiskey takes years to age and can't be produced on demand. This led to severe shortages of aged Japanese whiskey, causing prices for well-known bottles to skyrocket and pushing some brands to remove age statements entirely just to keep bottles on shelves. Japanese whiskey making tends to emphasize extreme precision and subtlety compared to the bolder styles found elsewhere, often using Mizunara oak, a rare Japanese oak that imparts unique sandalwood and incense-like notes you don't find in any other whiskey in the world. Corn whiskey. Corn whiskey requires a mash of at least 80% corn and is typically either unaged or aged only very briefly, which is why it's often clear or very pale in color rather than the deep amber of bourbon. This style is the closest legal modern equivalent to Old American moonshine, the illegally distilled corn spirit that families across Appalachia and the rural South produced in homemade stills to avoid federal alcohol taxes, especially during Prohibition. Moonshiners often ran their stills at night to avoid detection by smoke or light, which is where the name moonshine actually comes from. Corn whiskey has a much sweeter, rawer, and grainier taste than aged whiskeys, since it skips most or all of the barrel aging that mellows other styles and adds complexity. Because it doesn't require years of storage before it can be sold, corn whiskey was historically one of the fastest and cheapest spirits for small farmers to produce and sell for quick cash. Today, several legal distilleries market their corn whiskey specifically as moonshine, sometimes flavoring it with fruit or sugar to recreate the taste of the old homemade versions while staying fully within modern liquor laws.
Wheat whiskey. Wheat whiskey uses a mash of at least 51% wheat instead of corn or rye, producing a notably softer, rounder, and sweeter flavor with less of the spicy bite that rye whiskey has or the heavy caramel punch of bourbon. Wheat has long been used as a secondary grain in bourbon recipes to soften the flavor, which is where the term wheated bourbon comes from. But standalone wheat whiskey uses wheat as the dominant grain rather than just a supporting ingredient. Historically, wheat whiskey has always been a much smaller category in America compared to bourbon and rye, partly because wheat crops were often more valuable for baking bread than for distilling spirits, especially during periods of grain shortages. The style has seen a modest revival among craft distillers in recent years, who market it as an easier entry point for people who find rye too spicy and bourbon too heavy. Because wheat lacks the oily proteins found in rye and corn, wheat whiskey tends to have a noticeably smoother, almost bread-like mouthfeel that some distillers describe as more approachable for whiskey newcomers. Single pot still Irish whiskey. Single pot still is a uniquely Irish style made from a mash of both malted and unmalted barley, distilled in traditional copper pot stills at a single distillery. The use of unmalted barley alongside the malted grain dates back to a 1800s British tax that specifically taxed malted barley, so Irish distillers began mixing in raw, unmalted barley to reduce their tax burden while still producing a full-flavored whiskey. That tax-driven workaround accidentally created a completely distinct style, giving single pot still whiskey a signature spicy, creamy, almost oily texture that sets it apart from both single malt Scotch and blended Irish whiskey. For much of the 1900s, this style nearly vanished along with the broader collapse of the Irish whiskey industry, surviving mainly through a small number of legacy brands. The revival of Irish whiskey over the past 2 decades has brought renewed attention back to single pot still specifically, with several distilleries reviving historic recipes and mash bills that had been abandoned for generations. Middleton Distillery in County Cork remains the most significant producer keeping this specific style alive at scale today. Peated whiskey. Peated whiskey gets its distinctive smoky, medicinal, almost campfire-like flavor from drying malted barley over burning peat, a dense layer of partially decomposed plant matter found in bogs across Scotland, particularly on the island of Islay. Before modern kilns existed, peat was simply the most abundant and affordable fuel available in Scotland's often treeless landscape, so early distillers used it out of necessity rather than choice, and that smoky character became a defining regional signature almost by accident. The smoke compounds from burning peat are measured in parts per million of a chemical called phenol, and some extremely heavily peated whiskeys can exceed 50 parts per million, creating an intensely smoky, almost tar-like flavor that some drinkers love and others find overwhelming. Islay in particular became famous for producing some of the smokiest whiskeys in the world, partly because the local peat itself contains maritime plant matter that adds a distinct briny, seaweed-like quality you don't get from peat found further inland. Peated whiskey has developed an almost cult-like following among enthusiasts internationally, and heavily peated bottles from famous Islay distilleries are frequently ranked among the most sought-after whiskeys at auction. Cask-strength whiskey. Cask-strength whiskey is bottled directly from the barrel without dilution, meaning the alcohol percentage stays exactly where the aging process left it, often somewhere between 55 and 65%, rather than being cut down with water to the standard 40% found in most commercial whiskeys. Most whiskey naturally loses some alcohol content during aging through evaporation, a phenomenon distillers call the angel's share. But even after years of that evaporation, cask-strength whiskey remains dramatically stronger than a typical bottle. This style became became popular among enthusiasts specifically because it lets drinkers control the dilution themselves by adding their own water or ice, which changes how the whiskey's aromas and flavors open up, something a master distiller can't fully predict or replicate at the standard bottling proof. Cask strength releases are often treated as premium, limited products since each barrel produces spirit at a slightly different strength depending on how it aged, meaning no two cask strength batches are ever perfectly identical. Whiskey reviewers and collectors frequently seek out cask strength bottles specifically because they're seen as showing the truest, least altered version of what a distillery's spirit actually tastes like straight out of the barrel. Indian whiskey. India is technically the largest whiskey consuming market in the world by volume, but for decades, most of what was sold domestically as whiskey was actually a molasses-based spirit flavored to taste similar to grain whiskey, since India's hot climate made growing enough barley for true malt whiskey historically difficult and expensive. That molasses-based style is still hugely popular and dominates sales figures, which is why international whiskey bodies have long debated whether it should even be classified as whiskey at all under global standards. Over the past 2 decades, a newer wave of Indian single malt distilleries has emerged, using actual malted barley and aging it in India's intensely hot and humid climate, which speeds up the aging process dramatically compared to Scotland's cool weather. A whiskey that might need 10 or 12 years in a Scottish warehouse can develop similar depth and oak character in just 4 or 5 years in an Indian climate, though the trade-off is that far more liquid evaporates during that faster aging. These modern Indian single malts have started winning international awards and blind tastings against established Scotch brands, putting India on the map as a serious whiskey-producing country rather than just the world's biggest consumer. World whiskeys. Beyond the traditional producing countries, a wave of newer whiskey regions has emerged over the past few decades, each adapting the process to their own climate and ingredients. Taiwan built an entire premium whiskey industry around its hot, humid climate, which accelerates aging dramatically, similar to India, allowing young Taiwanese whiskeys to develop remarkable depth in a fraction of the time Scotch typically requires. Australian distillers, especially in the cooler climate of Tasmania, have built a reputation for rich, sherry cask-influenced single malts that have picked up major international awards despite the industry there being barely a few decades old. In Sweden and other parts of Scandinavia, distillers have started experimenting with local peat and unique cask finishes influenced by the region's brewing and winemaking traditions. Even countries with little historical connection to whiskey at all, like South Africa and parts of South America, have opened distilleries in the last 20 years, often marketing themselves specifically around how their climate speeds up or otherwise changes the aging process compared to the traditional cold cellars of Scotland and Ireland. This global expansion has turned whiskey from a spirit associated with just a handful of countries into a genuinely worldwide category, with serious award-winning production now happening on nearly every continent.